The 87-year-old Leo Sharp was calmly driving his Lincoln pickup truck down the highway towards Detroit. But just seconds later, flashing police lights lit up behind him and he had to pull over. His heartbeat increased and his hands began to shake. He was visibly nervous, and for good reason. The old man was the best drug runner for the Sinaloa Cartel, and in his trunk was more than 100 kilos of cocaine. A seemingly ordinary trip threatened to become a disaster. Thanks to the brilliant acting and directing of Clint Eastwood, the man who made the Mule, the whole world learned of Leo Sharp. But the real story is much bigger than that. Leo Sharp worked for the cartel for over 10 years and transported dozens of tons of cocaine. So how did he manage to work for so many years without ever getting caught? Why did he do it at such an advanced age? And did he manage to escape the iron hand of the justice system? The war on drugs is a pointless drama. Its cost is divided among ordinary people, and Leo Sharp's story is proof to that, especially its roller coaster ending. Aged 18, while World War II was in full swing, Sharp went off to serve at the front, and after serving for over a year in the 88th Infantry Division, earned the Bronze Star Medal for fighting in one of the most brutal battles of the Italian campaign. After a successful military career, Sharp returned to his native Indiana, where he soon faced the question of what to do next. He got into gardening, although that was more akin to a hobby than an actual job. Sharp only began making good money in the 1970s, when he was the owner of a small airline. Unfortunately, Leo couldn't manage to keep the company afloat for long, and eventually the airline went bankrupt. But Sharp didn't have to despair too much, as he already had made a decent bit of money, which he could use to invest in a different business venture, one that was more to his liking. Being head over heels in love with gardening for all his life, Leo Sharp decided to invest in a flower business. Sharp soon became the owner of a flower farm near Lake Michigan, not far from his home in Michigan City. His new company was called Brookwood Gardens, and it specialized in daylilies. Daylilies crossbreed quite easily, and this is where Leo unleashed his imagination, creating and registering 180 new unique hybrid varieties under his name. For reference, most breeders manage to register only a few dozen over their entire life. At Brookwood Gardens, Sharp produced relatively small flowers in stunning yellows, reds, and pinks. Leo was obsessed with gardening, spending most of his time on the farm. It didn't take long for his business to quickly take off, allowing him to open another farm in Apopka, Florida. Within a few years of starting his flower business, Sharp's home farm had become the country's leading daylily breeder. Word of his dazzling flowers spread throughout, and Sharp soon became well known. Daylily lovers made pilgrimages to his flower farms, and Leo's neighbors claimed that buses filled with an endless stream of customers eager to buy the exquisite, colorful flowers would park outside Sharp's home. Leo Sharp became a popular guest at flower shows and conferences across the country and traveled frequently, wearing all-white or all-black leisure suits to such events. His popularity reached such a level of magnitude that during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, the presidential administration invited the daylily king to plant some of his flowers in the White House rose garden. Leo Sharp was considered a tenured expert, serving as a regional vice president of the American Hemerocallis Daylily Society, as well as being nominated as a judge at flower competitions. The world of daylilies belonged to him. He was an idol of many gardeners and collectors. Leo liked this life. He was respected, people were proud of him, and he was the center of attention. Of course, such an obsession with daylilies affected his family life, but not to the degree it was portrayed in Clint Eastwood's Mule. Leo's wife was 3 years younger than him. They had 3 children, and although the father of the family was constantly away at work, they lived under one roof. For many years, Sharp produced an annual multicolored catalog of all his new daylilies, a luxury at the time, showcasing their dazzling array of blooms, a novel keepsake that his fans treasured. Many still consider the 1995 catalog, which featured 24 new daylilies, to be his best. This year was truly the peak for Leo Sharp and his flower business, a real triumph. But soon, unexpectedly, Sharp's business began to collapse. The downhill spiral was so rapid and so intense that Leo barely had any time to patch up the holes. His catalogs quickly began to chew themselves up, becoming thinner by the year, and in the late 90s, they switched to a black and white format. So what happened? Where did Sharp go wrong? The internet, which was gradually gaining momentum, was ultimately to blame. People increasingly resorted to the services of the World Wide Web, ordering any product they were interested in online. This trend also affected the daylily business. Leo could only save his business by switching to an electronic format, but Sharp, having poor computer skills, didn't want to remodel his business to meet the new reality. He continued to cling to the old, publishing paper catalogs that no one needed. Sticking to the tried-and-true strategy proved fatal in the changing business landscapes. Sharp spent all his savings, got into debt, all to somehow try to keep his business afloat, but nothing worked. His Brookwood Gardens went bankrupt. For a man who was obsessed with his work as Sharp, this was a cruel blow. He would not and did not want to imagine what to do next. He was simply heartbroken. Yes, he was already well over 70, but it was the daylilies that gave his life meaning, made Sharp himself bloom, just like his beautiful flowers. Crucially, there was no way to get back into it. A lot of money was needed, and Sharp was too old. The Mexicans who worked on the old man's farm saw how desperate Leo was and offered to help him. They knew people who knew other people, and these people needed a good, reliable driver who didn't have any prior problems with the law. The money they offered for one trip was decent enough, but this wasn't any regular package delivery. It was a huge amount of cash. All Sharp had to do was drive to Arizona, let the guys fill his truck with packages, and drive it back to Michigan. It didn't take much to persuade Sharp. So, getting into his old red pickup truck, he made the trip, doing exactly as he was asked. The old man was no fool and knew that he was dealing with people who weren't entirely on the right side of the law. He doubted he would receive the agreed-upon payment, but his worries were for naught. The envelope in the glove box of his truck contained exactly the amount they had settled on. It was a lot of money. Easy money. Soon, Sharp was approached with an offer of continued cooperation. The men said that Sharp would still mainly transport cash, but in the future, he would also have to transport narcotics. Of course, the payment for such goods would be much higher. This somewhat discouraged Sharp. He had lived a respectable life, was a war veteran, a famous gardener, and simply a man who was admired. And here he was being asked to not only break the law, but also to step over himself, over all his past life. If he were caught, his reputation, honor, and everything he had achieved would be over. But this was a good chance to settle all his problems. He could guarantee himself a solid retirement, help his family, and most importantly, save what he loved most in the world, his daylily farm. Sharp saw no other way to earn such a large amount of money. There was, however, something else that was holding the old man back from making the decision. He learned that his employer was the Mexican Sinaloa Cartel, one of the most powerful and influential criminal organizations in the world. Getting involved with drug dealers is always dangerous, but in Sinaloa's case, the danger was multiplied. Even though Sharp was 76, he still wanted to live. Doubts tormented the daily aficionado for a long time. Finally, having made up his mind, Leo contacted the cartel. When asked if the old man would continue working, Sharp answered, yes. It was a huge risk, but the money he would make it worthwhile. So, around 2000, Leo Sharp became a drug courier, and, as it turned out, he was not only the oldest, but also the most successful courier of the Sinaloa Cartel. Be it today or 25 years ago, the U.S. intelligence continues to consider the Sinaloa Cartel to be the largest and most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, perhaps even more influential than Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel at its peak. The Sinaloa Cartel works like a Swiss watch, and its organizational structure and unconventional approach to business have helped it stay on top all these years. One of its favorite methods of drug smuggling was tunnels dug under the U.S.-Mexico border. Having the goods successfully transported across the border, the couriers got to work delivering the product all over the country. As a rule, the couriers were also quite unconventional. Often, the drivers were elderly or disabled people, like Walter Ogden, a 57-year-old man from Oklahoma. On disability since 2010 and having suffered 4 heart attacks, Ogden was the perfect man for the job. Leo Sharp was in a similar position to Ogden. He had a legitimate ID, was an elderly war veteran, and had no criminal record. No one would suspect someone like that of transporting narcotics. In addition, Sharp was constantly on the road, visiting numerous flower shows. This ensured he had a reliable cover in case questions arose as to why he spent so much time behind the wheel. At first, Sharp transported around 220 pounds per trip, but the longer he worked, the more cocaine was loaded into his truck. At times, the number exceeded 660 pounds. It's easy to see why this job was so tempting. Couriers were typically paid $1,000 per kilo, meaning the old man was making at least $100,000 per trip. He was the last person anyone would suspect of being a drug runner. Thus, he could drive all over the country, dropping off shipments at any specified location and never stopping. His trips usually began in Tucson, where several distribution houses were located next to each other. One was filled with products for Chicago, one for Boston, and one for Detroit. Most of the time, Sharp would drive the goods from Arizona to Detroit, unload them, and then head back, this time carrying more than $2 million in cartel profits from narcotics. Over time, the old man became trusted in a way that no other courier was. While other drug mules weren't allowed to even look at the people loading their cars and weren't allowed to look at the contents inside, Sharp would drive right into drug dens and chat with the cartel members as if they were old-time buddies. The cartel goons didn't mind. They liked the cheerful, carefree old man. Leo also became good friends with his handler, Viejo, the head of the Detroit branch of the cartel, spending more than one vacation with him in Hawaii, and no doubt having a great time. The cartel held its most effective courier in high regard, nicknaming him El Tata, the grandfather. The amount of product he transported had long exceeded thousands of pounds, and the money that Tata brought in amounted to millions of dollars. Sharp, for his part, wasn't left in the dust either. He paid off all his debts, helped his friends and family, going as far as buying his daughter a house in Hawaii, donated some money to charity, and even treated himself by trading in his old truck for a brand new, fully loaded Lincoln Mark LT, a luxury trim of the renowned F-150. Driving such a premium car, Tata, no doubt, became more noticeable on the road, but he didn't care. After all, it wasn't a brand new Ferrari. Ultimately, though, all these splurges of wealth paled in comparison to Sharp's primary goal of getting his flower business back on its feet. With his newfound wealth, it didn't take long for Leo to get Brookwood Gardens operating and grow flowers once again. Oddly enough, no one seemed to bat an eye where an 80-year-old suddenly found so much money. It seemed like people either didn't care or thought veteran pensions were that good. Sharp could have called it. The daylilies were saved, and Tata had earned more than enough to last him until he reached at least 100, an estimate given to him by his doctor. But the cartel didn't want to lose its best courier. Sharp, for his part, also wasn't ready to throw in the towel, believing himself invulnerable before the law. He enjoyed the feeling of being important, and this, judging by the fact that the old man had more than enough money, became a much more compelling reason for him to stay. He continued to work as a courier for quite some time, totaling over 10 years by the end of it all. Over all those years, he was never stopped by the police, and the only time he had to talk to a sheriff was in Mexico, where Sharp was among the witnesses of a fight outside of a motel. The fact that he was transporting goods that were destroying human lives did not seem to bother him much. Pretty much believing that delivering cocaine was little different than delivering daylilies, he considered sharing a plant that made people feel good to be a positive. Sharp would later say, "All of God's plants that lift people's spirits are created for a specific purpose, to occupy the minds of depressed people and make them feel good. A great way of thinking about it is to alleviate any pangs of conscience." Despite the doctor's prognosis of Sharp's health, the old man gradually began to wane. Physically, he was still vigorous and healthy, but mentally, old age ailments began to manifest themselves, in particular dementia, which worsened with each passing year. Driving became difficult, and long journeys became increasingly painful. When Tata eventually decided to leave the game and informed his employers, they did not affirm the immediate resignation he expected. The cartel's goal was to squeeze the old man dry, so they promised the 87-year-old an eventual retirement. But with each successful drug run, they postponed it, forcing him into more assignments. In October of 2011, an event happened that was poised to radically change their working relationship. Leo Sharp had a run-in with the law. The old man was calmly cruising down the highway, carrying product for Detroit, when suddenly a police siren whooped behind his truck. Sharp pulled over, and without waiting for the officer to approach his door, he got out of the car himself. "What's going on, officer?" the old man asked. "At 87 years old, I want to know why I'm being pulled over." The cop demanded the driver's license and registration. Sharp began to talk incoherently about his age and for a long time could not provide the requested information. It seemed that he did not understand what day it was. Sharp was exceedingly nervous, and it was noticeable to the naked eye, let alone one of a trained professional. As the officer spoke, Tata kept cupping his ear to hear him better. The officer asked if he had a gun. A gun? At 87? For what? "Officer, please." Sharp was being too obvious about his age, hoping that the cop would see him as a harmless old man and let him go quickly, but they weren't going to do that. Sharp began filling the officer in about his life, mentioning that he was a war veteran, going over his plant hybridization line of work, and that he was now going to visit an old brothers-in-arms who went by Van Velder. When the officer asked for his friend's address or phone number, the old man said he couldn't remember it. "Are you carrying drugs?" the patrolman asked. Tata answered in the negative. That's when the policeman said they would have to search the car. The old man, shaking from anxiety, began to evade the question in every possible way. He said he would prefer that the patrolman not search his car so that he could continue his way in peace. "I have to get to my destination before dark, officer," he said. "I'm not very good at driving after dark." Then, when a drug-sniffing dog took an interest in the bed of the truck, Sharp said he left the keys to the trunk at his sister's house in Iowa. The old man then began to beg for pity, saying, "Why don't you just kill me and let me just leave the planet?" The fall was near, and the old man resisted it as best he could, but it was all in vain. The police were able to open the locked trunk door, where among the piles of old clothes and food wrappers, they found 5 duffel bags containing 104 kilograms of cocaine. The stress almost made the old man collapse, but he managed to stay on his feet and only quietly uttered, "Oh my God." The 43-year-old Jeff Moore wasn't the cop who pulled over Sharp, but he was the one who ran the operation from start to finish, and he was the one who put the DEA on the trail of the legendary drug mule. Moore started as a street cop in Kansas City, Missouri, handling domestic disputes and traffic violations. He eventually made his way into the drug scene, where he went undercover. When Moore was promoted to join the DEA in Detroit in 2004, he was eager to prove himself, but he ran into a lot of bureaucratic red tape and ended up catching only small-time dealers. His big break came in 2011, when a bust led to a dealer named Tusa, who gave up the name of a local big-time dealer, Ramon Ramos. Tusa quickly fled to Mexico, and Jeff Moore began investigating the mysterious Ramos, tracking him all over Detroit. Soon, the house where Ramos lived was found, and, having received a search warrant, Jeff Moore, with a group of officers, raided his home and found more than $350,000 in cash. That could have been the end of it, but Ramos claimed he was an accountant for a crime group that was part of the Sinaloa Cartel and was willing to cooperate in the hopes that it would buy him impunity by entering the witness protection program. When he gave the key to his books that were written in codes and symbols, he provided a paper trail that allowed the DEA to map out a vast network they had never known existed. Ramon Ramos proved to be the perfect informant, doing everything Moore asked him without question. And thanks to his information, the DEA made several arrests, getting ever closer to the big bust. It was Ramos who first told Moore about an older courier who had been working successfully for the cartel for many years. They called him Tata. Tata operated on a scale the Detroit DEA had never encountered. According to handwritten drug registries obtained by the government, the old man was delivering at least 200 kilograms of drugs each month. In February 2010, for example, he delivered 246 kilograms, and in March, 250. In September 2011, Ramos met Tata at a warehouse where several men were loading bags full of cash into the old man's car. Ramos was wearing a video recording device, and through it, Moore got his first glimpse of the cartel's most prolific drug mule. He was an 87-year-old man, but he resembled nothing of the image most people would have of someone that age. The old man was spry, strong, and constantly cracking jokes about the trip. After the car was loaded and Tata was ready to go, he asked Ramos to pick up some onions from Georgia. The old man was friendly to everyone, and neither his behavior nor his appearance resembled the courier who transported drugs on such a massive scale. It's no wonder he was still at large. Had the cartel allowed Sharp to stop transporting products when he asked, he would have likely still been free of the law. The cartel was taking a huge risk by trusting an 87-year-old to continue to transport such expensive cargo. Tata's dementia was getting worse, and it was sometimes becoming all too obvious in his sloppy behavior. During one of his trips, Sharp stopped at a repair shop to fix something on his truck. This would have been completely fine if there hadn't been 100 kilos of coke in the car. If one of the mechanics had investigated one of the bags, there would have been problems. Also, during one of his trips, the aging Sharp suddenly got lost on the streets of Detroit, a city he knew by heart. His contact had to rescue the grandfather, who met Sharp and led him to his destination. Viejo, Sharp's curator and friend from his vacations to Hawaii, said that once after a conversation with the old man, he called him back within minutes. Tata forgot what they had just talked about and asked him to repeat it. Over the years, Sharp had also become increasingly hot-tempered and had trouble keeping his emotions in check, leading some members of the cartel to complain. As valuable a drug mule as Tata was, he had to be cut loose and allowed to live out his days in peace, growing daylilies. Sooner or later, he would get himself caught. Of course, if the old man had been caught by the police, the cartel could still easily have hired 100 more couriers. After all, it was the cost of doing business. But who knows what the old man could have told the police? He knew a lot more than the average courier. The cartel dragged its feet, and Sharp was targeted by the DEA, who planned to arrest him at the first opportunity. On October 21, 2011, the old man was placed under surveillance. A dozen DEA agents in unmarked cars were scattered along a 70-mile stretch from Kalamazoo to Jackson, Michigan. Around 3 p.m., the elderly drug mule's Lincoln was spotted. Tata was carrying cargo for Detroit. Sharp was not going fast, but was swerving erratically. One of the agents got on Sharp's tail, staying half a mile behind him. Gradually, more cars were following him, and soon a whole squadron was following the 87-year-old man. At some point, Sharp turned right onto the exit from the highway. Jeff Moore, who was in one of the cars chasing Sharp, became visibly nervous, thinking that Tata had spotted the tail. The old man pulled into a fast food joint, ordered French fries and a milkshake, and, with the shake in hand, drove right back onto the highway. Moore sighed with relief. Tata just wanted to grab a bite. The pursuit continued, and an hour later, a patrolman was signaled to hail the courier's car, but to make it look like a routine check. The DEA did not want to compromise the investigation. Jeff Moore and other agents watched from afar as the patrolman stopped the pickup and the freighted Sharp got out. He was wearing a plaid shirt, khaki pants, white socks, and brown shoes. His hair was unkempt and his walk was shaky. He was unshaven and had thick white mutton chops. The police searched the trunk of the car and found 100 kilos of cocaine worth about $3 million. Leo Sharp's decade-long run of luck was over. After the old man was handcuffed, Jeff Moore put him in his car and drove him to the DEA office in Detroit. The agent was tormented by mixed feelings. Yes, they had caught the cartel's golden boy, their best courier, but looking at the decrepit old man, he did not feel a sense of euphoria that should have accompanied such an occasion. A lot of wasted time and money, and for what? To catch an old man who was 1 foot in the grave already? It wouldn't change anything in the fight against drug traffickers, and instead of one courier that got busted, the cartels would have a dozen willing others. Leo Sharp, who had been sitting silently at first, began to speak. He talked about his childhood, his military service in Italy, his family, and, of course, his beloved flower farm. It seemed like he was talking to himself, remembering the good old days, but Moore was interested in what he had to say. In the end, he shared hard-earned advice. No matter how much you earn, your family should be above it. Sharp, who had lived a long, exciting life, did not imagine it to end like this. People admired him, held him up as an example, asked his opinion, and considered him a most trustworthy person. But now, the very end of his story was stained with a blot that could not be washed off, and the daylilies, his beloved daylilies, would be left without an owner. Despite the obvious signs of senile dementia, Tata knew full well what a nightmare awaited him. However, over the years of working for the cartel, the old man had managed to amass a decent fortune, enough to hire a first-class lawyer who, in turn, could significantly soften his fall. 20 years in prison. This was the punishment that Leo Sharp was facing. Considering that the old man was 87, getting such a sentence was akin to death. He could have scored points if he had cooperated with the investigation, but Sharp flatly refused to do so, not wanting to snitch on his former employers. However, even without suspecting it, he still managed to rain hell on the cartel. After Sharp was arrested, agents thoroughly searched his Lincoln. The car was a mess of food wrappers, half-eaten sandwiches, and other garbage. And yet, the agents were able to find something of interest: a crumpled piece of paper with a name and a Miami area code phone number. They traced the phone number to a Miami home owned by Viejo, the longtime friend of Leo's. DEA agents continued their investigation, and 4 months after Sharp's arrest, they struck 10 cartel-linked locations, taking them all down in a single day. Within days, the cartel goons had been indicted on 19 charges, and all but 2 have since pleaded guilty. It was a huge win for the DEA. Numerous cartel members were arrested, including their main courier, causing the street price of cocaine to jump from $30,000 to $43,000 per kilo. But while the cartel suffered losses, it hardly affected their business. On the contrary, cocaine becoming more expensive meant increased profits from sales. It would seem drug manufacturers should start sending DEA agents thank you cards for helping keep drug prices high, who, through their arrests, sometimes spiked those prices to the skies. Meanwhile, Sharp awaited trial. He knew about the arrests and how serious the sentences for some of his former employees were. The distributors got up to 16 years. 2 couriers were luckier, getting 5 and 7 years in prison, even though they moved far fewer drugs than Tata. But unlike the others, Tata had a major advantage: his age and obvious signs of senile dementia, something his lawyer, Daryl Goldberg, repeatedly cited. He filed an 18-page sentencing brief, hoping to convince the judge that house arrest would be an appropriate punishment for his client. He is a bright, self-made, generous man who worked hard throughout his remarkable, extraordinary, and long life, his lawyer wrote. He claimed Sharp was forced to work at gunpoint. He drew on the old man's military record, saying, "This is not how we honor our heroes." The fiery speeches had their desired effect. Prosecutors began to recommend that Sharp, due to his age, serve 5 years, which was significantly better than the original 20. And yet, even 5 years was too much for such an old man. It was necessary to continue to press the case, which is what Goldberg did. The lawyer presented the court with a neuropsychological evaluation that found that Sharp's profile was consistent with feeble-mindedness. Goldberg was good and certainly worth every dollar. All that remained was to wait for the trial. The trial took place exactly 2 years after Sharp's arrest. During the trial, the old man was very nervous and constantly attracted attention to himself with ridiculous actions. He often stood up and interrupted the judge with unusual stories or jokes. He showed bailiffs pictures of his daughter in Hawaii, saying, "They live in a nice place. It's paradise." He also had a nervous habit of chuckling to himself every few minutes, and during one of the recesses, he leaned back against the defense table and burped twice. The prosecution had photographs of Sharp and Viejo on vacation in Hawaii, meaning the defense's version that the old man was initially forced to work at gunpoint was not true. The prosecution also had evidence that Sharp had been working for the cartel since the 2000s, which was more than 10 years ago. How many drug addicts are on the streets of Detroit right now because of Mr. Sharp? The prosecutor asked. The defense appealed to the old man's mental decline. saying that if he were sent to prison, it would be an expensive burden on the government. The tug-of-war went on for quite some time, and toward the end, it became obvious that the old man would not escape prison. Before he passed the sentence, the judge gave the floor to Leo Sharp. No one expected to hear anything intelligible from the old mule, so everyone was floored when the old man, in a quiet, hoarse voice, uttered, "I am truly heartbroken by what I did, but it is done." At that moment, he looked like a man who sincerely regretted his actions. His feeble-mindedness seemed to have retreated for a brief minute, allowing the old man to collect his thoughts and, with a clear head, admitted to his wrongdoings. This didn't last long, however. He proceeded to make a second statement, which was much more in line with his previous utterances, stating that if he could avoid prison, he offered to pay the $500,000 that the court had fined him by growing Hawaiian papayas. "It's so sweet and delicious," he said, his voice almost breaking. The government allowed Sharp to keep the daylily farm, but the old man himself faced prison. Even considering his advanced age and all his prior achievements, Leo Sharp still had to be evicted, so that everyone involved with the drug trade would know that even at 90 years old, people go to prison for breaking the law. Tata was sentenced to 3 years.
Heartbroken!
The old man was crushed. He told reporters that he would not live in a toilet with bars, ever. He threatened to commit suicide.
I'll kill myself!
But what did he expect? To transport literal tons of drugs and get suspended sentence or house arrest? In fact, for the magnitude of the crime, getting only 3 years was a gargantuan victory. Such a sentence does nothing to scare off those who are interested in making quick and easy money. Of course, Sharp's age, infirmity, honorable past, and even skin color played into his hands. In prison, the old man had plenty of time to think about what he had done. And although he had previously broached the subject of suicide, he did not keep his promise. The old man calmed down and accepted that he would have to serve the rest of his days in prison. He realized that for the sake of his beloved daylilies, he should not have gotten involved with drug dealers. It would have been much safer and calmer to adapt to modern realities, study computers, and sell flowers through the increasingly popular internet. On the other hand, for 10 years, no one from the alphabet agencies were interested in him, and if Sharp had managed to retire in time, he would have remained free, and his reputation, which he valued so much, would not have suffered. And yet, some activities made Sharp's prison stay not as dreadful as it could have been. He was permitted to grow daylilies, and a special plot of land was allotted for this purpose. Soon, he also received good news. A little less than a year after his conviction, Sharp's lawyer and federal prosecutors asked the judge to release Sharp on humanitarian grounds. They said the old man had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and had a life expectancy of 6 to 9 months. The final word was up to the district judge, and she agreed that the 91-year-old man should be released. In 2015, after serving only a year in prison, Leo Sharp was released and returned to his home in Michigan City. There, the old man had his daylilies waiting for him, but he had almost no strength left to care for them. Sharp knew that soon he would have to say the final goodbye to his beautiful flowers. His illness rapidly progressed, and his children and wife, who did not die of cancer as shown in the film, took the old man to live with them in Hawaii, in a house that Sharp had bought with drug money. Leo Sharp lived longer than expected, no doubt aided by not having the stress of being behind bars, dying a year and a half after his release. He was buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, the final resting place for those who served in the U.S. military. With Sharp's death, his daylilies disappeared. Nothing but bare patches of brown earth remained where there had once been a vibrant field of flowers, awe-inspiring in their beauty. The story of an elderly drug courier who transported tons of drugs for a decade is indicative of how pointless and hopeless the fight against drug dealers truly is. Regardless of our attitude towards Leo Sharp, regardless of his motives, he was still a major criminal, and a lot of time, effort, and of course money was spent on his arrest. But what was the result? The Sinaloa Cartel's most prolific drug mule was released after just a year. And that's the whole absurdity of the war on drugs that began a half-century prior and will continue in perpetuity unless something changes. No matter how hard the government tries, the cartels will always find a way to deliver their goods. Legalization of drugs? That's a difficult question. The main advantage would be that the cartels would have nothing to offer, and the obligation to fight them would disappear. If a person wants drugs, they will get them. It doesn't matter whether they're illegal or not. So what is the point of this war? The high-profile story of Leo Sharp shook people for a brief time while it was still current news, but it didn't take long for everything to return to the way it was. And yet, the more stories like the story of Leo Sharp exist, the more attention is paid to the problem. No one should profit from drugs at the expense of other people's lives.